September 15, 1940. RAF Kenley, Surrey. 1647 hours. Pilot Officer Thomas Brennan taxied his Spitfire toward the dispersal area with fuel gauge reading empty, ammunition expended, and radio dead from battle damage. 20 years old. 3 weeks of operational flying. And 15 minutes ago, over the Kent countryside, he had made a navigational error so fundamental that it violated the first principle taught to every fighter pilot. He'd turned the wrong way. During a furious dogfight with a Bf-109, disoriented by G-forces and adrenaline, he'd broken left when doctrine demanded he break right, into the enemy's turn circle instead of away from it, the maneuver that every instructor warned would put you directly in the enemy's guns. Except it hadn't. The Messerschmitt pilot, expecting the standard defensive break to the right, had committed to that intercept angle. When Brennan went left instead into what should have been a fatal error, the German found himself overshooting, momentarily out of position, giving Brennan a 2-second window to reverse and fire a deflection shot that sent the 109 spiraling toward the channel trailing smoke. 1 kill. Pure accident. The kind of luck that rookies sometimes got before experience taught them how to die properly. Except squadron leader Marcus Webb had been watching from 8,000 feet above, and Webb had seen something that Brennan himself didn't understand. He'd seen geometry that contradicted everything the RAF taught about fighter combat. RAF Fighter Command in September 1940 operated according to tactical doctrines refined through 2 decades of peacetime theory and 3 months of desperate combat during the Battle of Britain. The principles were clear, proven through hundreds of engagements written in blood and validated by survival. When attacked from behind, break hard into a climbing turn away from the enemy's approach vector. This forced the attacker to adjust his intercept angle, consumed his energy advantage, and allowed your squadron mates to engage while he was committed to pursuing you. Breaking toward the enemy was suicide. It reduced the angular distance he needed to achieve firing position, simplified his deflection calculations, and positioned you perfectly in his gun sight. Every combat manual, every training exercise, every veteran's hard-won wisdom said, break away, not toward. The doctrine wasn't arbitrary. It was mathematics refined through survival. Pilots who broke correctly lived to fly again. Pilots who broke incorrectly became statistics. Thomas Brennan had broken incorrectly and survived. Squadron leader Webb found him in the dispersal hut 20 minutes after landing, still shaking from adrenaline, filling out the combat report that would document his first kill and his fundamental navigational error. Talk me through the engagement, Webb said, his tone unreadable. Brennan described it with the hesitant precision of someone expecting reprimand. The 109 diving from his 7 o'clock high, the standard call from his wingman, the instinctive break that went the wrong direction because he'd gotten disoriented during the turn. I broke left instead of right, sir, into his turn circle. It was a mistake, I realized that. And then what happened? He overshot, sir. I think he was expecting me to break right, and when I went left, he was committed to the wrong intercept angle. I reversed into him, got about 2 seconds of firing position, and hit his cooling system. Webb pulled out a notepad, began sketching approach angles and turn circles. You broke toward the enemy's approach vector. Yes, sir. It was wrong. Was it? You're alive. He's not. By what definition was it wrong? Brennan stared at him. Sir, every instructor, every manual, every doctrine is built on assumptions. Webb interrupted. The assumption here is that breaking away increases your survival probability. But what if that assumption only holds when the enemy expects you to break away? Sir, what if the enemy's firing solution is calculated based on the predicted direction of your defensive break? What if your mistake worked precisely because it contradicted his expectations? Brennan felt something shift in his understanding, though he couldn't articulate what. Write it up completely, Webb said. Every detail. Because if what you did accidentally works consistently, we need to understand why before we teach it to every pilot in Fighter Command. The first person Webb brought the idea to was Wing Commander Patricia Ashworth, Fighter Command's Senior Tactical Development Officer, and one of the few women in operational planning roles. She listened to his description with the analytical intensity of someone who had studied aerial combat theory for a decade and watched its practical application kill pilots for 3 months. You're proposing that we teach pilots to break toward the enemy. I'm proposing we examine whether Brennan's mistake reveals a gap in our tactical doctrine. Marcus, our doctrine exists because it works. Breaking away from attack forces the enemy to adjust intercept angles, consumes his energy advantage, allows time for mutual support from squadron mates. And German pilots have spent 3 months learning to calculate their attack runs based on that exact response. They know we'll break away. They position themselves accordingly. We're predictable. Ashworth walked to the window overlooking the airfield, where Spitfires and Hurricanes were being rearmed and refueled for the next sortie. Young pilots, boys really, preparing to climb back into cockpits where doctrine was the only thing between them and death. If we're wrong, she said quietly, if we teach pilots to break toward attack and it doesn't work, we're sending them directly into enemy guns. The doctrine that keeps them alive becomes the instruction that kills them. And if we're right, if breaking toward creates the same unpredictability that saved Brennan, then we've been teaching suboptimal defensive tactics for 20 years, and dozens of pilots have died following procedures that made them easier to kill. The weight of that possibility filled the room. I need more data, Ashworth said. One successful engagement by a rookie who got disoriented doesn't prove tactical validity. It proves luck. Show me that it's replicable. Show me the geometry. Show me why this should work instead of just that it did work once. Agreed. I want to run controlled training exercises. Experienced pilots simulating attacks, defensive pilots attempting breaks in both directions, measuring success rates and survival probability. And if the data shows breaking toward is suicide, then we document one rookie's extraordinary luck and move on. And if it shows breaking toward is effective, Webb met her eyes. Then we acknowledge that our enemy has spent 3 months learning our patterns and we need to change the pattern before more pilots die following predictable procedures. Ashworth nodded slowly. You're asking Fighter Command to question fundamental doctrine in the middle of the most critical air battle in British history. I'm asking us to learn faster than the enemy adapts, because right now, they're winning that race. September 22nd, 1940, RAF Tangmere, combat training exercise. The test flight paired experienced pilots in simulated combat, one attacking, one defending, both instructed to push the engagement to realistic intensity without actually firing weapons. Gun cameras would record each approach, documenting whether defensive breaks toward or away from attack provided better survival outcomes. Flight Lieutenant Davies, veteran of 47 combat missions and holder of the Distinguished Flying Cross, flew the attacking aircraft. Pilot Officer Brennan, the rookie whose mistake had started this investigation, flew defense. Commencing attack run, Davies announced over the radio. Standard 6 o'clock high approach, speed advantage, textbook intercept angle. Brennan waited, feeling the familiar tension of knowing someone was positioning to kill you, then executed the standard defensive break. Hard right turn, climbing, forcing Davies to adjust his pursuit curve. Davies followed smoothly, maintaining firing position throughout the turn. Gun camera confirms I had firing solution for 4 seconds. Kill probability, high. They reset. Same initial conditions. This time Brennan broke left, toward Davies's approach vector, into what doctrine said was fatal geometry. Davies overshot. Not dramatically. Not with the spectacular failure that would indicate a fundamental error in German fighter tactics, but measurably. For 7 seconds, his gun camera pointed at empty sky while Brennan reversed inside his turn circle. Interesting, Davies said over the radio, his voice carefully neutral. Resetting for another run. They flew 12 more engagements over the next hour. 6 with standard breaks away from attack, 6 with unconventional breaks toward attack. The gun camera footage told a story that contradicted 2 decades of fighter doctrine. Standard breaks, away from attack. Average firing solution time, 3.8 seconds. Kill probability, 78%. Unconventional breaks, toward attack. Average firing solution time, 1.2 seconds. Kill probability, 31%. After landing, Davies found Webb and Ashworth in the analysis room, reviewing the footage frame by frame. It works, Davies said simply. Not every time, not with certainty, but consistently enough that it's not luck. When I expected the defending pilot to break away and he broke toward, my intercept calculations were wrong. I was committed to a pursuit angle that suddenly put me in the wrong position. Why? Ashworth asked. What's the underlying geometry? Predictability. My entire attack approach was calculated based on the assumption that the defender would break in the standard direction. When he didn't, I was flying the wrong solution to a problem that had changed. Webb looked at the data, at the footage, at the quantified evidence that a rookie's mistake had revealed a vulnerability in their own doctrine. We need to test this against actual German tactics, he said. With experienced pilots, combat conditions, real engagements. Because if this works operationally, we need to revise how we train every fighter pilot in the RAF. The proposal to introduce unconventional defensive breaks into operational training met immediate resistance from the pilots most qualified to evaluate it. Combat veterans who had survived by following doctrine perfectly. Squadron leader Jeffrey Martin, veteran of 89 combat missions, commander of 3 squadrons, and holder of the Distinguished Service Order, spoke for many when he reviewed Webb's tactical analysis. You're asking us to teach pilots to fly toward the enemy's guns. I'm asking us to teach pilots to be unpredictable. Marcus, predictability is how formations work. If I know my wingman will break right when attacked, I can position myself to cover him. If he breaks left when I'm expecting right, I might shoot him myself trying to engage his attacker. The operational complexity was real. Fighter tactics depended on coordination, mutual support, predictable responses that allowed pilots to work together without constant communication. Introducing unpredictability into defensive maneuvers could save individual pilots while disrupting formation cohesion. Wing Commander Ashworth addressed the concern with characteristic directness. Jeffrey, what's your squadron's loss rate over the past month? 18%. And how many of those losses were pilots following correct defensive procedures who were killed anyway? The silence was answer enough. We're not proposing abandoning coordination, Ashworth continued. We're proposing adding tactical flexibility, teaching pilots to recognize situations where unconventional breaks provide advantage, while maintaining standard procedures as the default response. So more decisions for pilots to make while being shot at. Yes, more cognitive load in combat, but also more options when standard responses aren't working. Martin pulled out casualty reports, pages of names, aircraft types, causes of loss. These men died following the best tactical doctrine we had. If we change that doctrine and more men die, we bear responsibility for that. We already bear responsibility, Webb said quietly, for maintaining doctrine that the enemy has learned to counter, for predictability that makes our pilots easier to kill, for assuming that what worked in 1938 still works in 1940 after the Luftwaffe has had months to study our tactics. Martin looked at the casualty reports, then at the gun camera data showing unconventional breaks reducing kill probability from 78% to 31%. Limited operational testing, he finally said. 3 squadrons, experienced pilots only, comprehensive evaluation. If it works, we expand implementation. If it doesn't, we stop before the casualty count rises. Agreed. And Marcus, if this goes wrong, if pilots die because we taught them to fly toward guns, that's on both of us. I understand. But Jeffrey, if pilots die because we refuse to adapt when we had evidence we should, that's on us too. October 1940. RAF Bentley Priory, Fighter Command Headquarters. The intelligence reports arrived from multiple sources. Pilot debriefings, interrogations of captured German aircrew, analysis of Luftwaffe tactical communications intercepted by the Y service listening stations scattered across southern England. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, Intelligence Analysis Division, presented his findings to the Tactical Development Committee with the careful precision of someone delivering news that would be unwelcome. German fighter pilots are trained to calculate deflection angles based on predicted defensive maneuvers. Their attack methodology assumes RAF fighters will break in specific directions based on approach vector. They position themselves accordingly, so our predictability is built into their tactics, Ashworth observed. Exactly. We've interrogated 3 Bf 109 pilots shot down over Kent in the past week. All of them described similar training. Approach from optimum angle, calculate interception based on expected defensive turn, adjust throttle to maintain firing position through standard evasive maneuvers. What happens when defenders don't execute standard maneuvers? Morrison pulled out combat reports from the squadrons testing unconventional breaks. Initial German response appears to be confusion and overcorrection. Pilots report enemy fighters overshooting, breaking off attacks or committing to firing solutions that put them in vulnerable positions. But they're adapting? Beginning to. We're seeing some German pilots adjust tactics, approaching from different angles, maintaining energy advantage longer, waiting to commit until defensive break direction is confirmed. The tactical surprise is temporary. Webb studied the intelligence summary, seeing the familiar pattern: innovation, enemy adaptation, counter-adaptation, The endless cycle of tactical evolution that defined aerial warfare. How long do we have before the Luftwaffe fully adapts? 3 to 6 months, possibly longer. But they're already circulating reports about unorthodox British defensive tactics. It's being studied. Wing Commander Ashworth pulled out operational statistics. 3 squadrons have been using unconventional breaks operationally for 2 weeks. Loss rates have dropped from 17% to 11%. That's 23 aircraft not lost, approximately 30 pilots alive, who statistically should be dead. For now, Morrison cautioned. Once the Germans fully understand the new tactics, they'll develop counters. The advantage will degrade. Every tactical advantage degrades, Webb said. The question isn't whether we maintain permanent superiority. The question is whether we innovate faster than the enemy adapts. Ashworth nodded. Then we need to expand implementation while we still have advantage, and simultaneously develop the next innovation for when this one becomes obsolete. Fighting 2 tactical generations ahead? Fighting to survive long enough that there is a next generation. Right now that means teaching every pilot and fighter command that sometimes the wrong turn is the right one. November 1940, RAF Biggin Hill, Squadron Commander's Office. Squadron Leader. Martin reviewed the training incident report with hands that refused to remain steady. Flight Lieutenant Carson, 24 years old, 11 operational missions, dead from training accident. Cause: attempted unconventional defensive break during practice engagement, lost control during the maneuver, spun into the ground from 4,000 feet. Carson had been following the new doctrine, following what Martin had approved for training, following procedures that were supposed to save lives. Wing Commander Ashworth arrived within the hour, saw Martin's face, understood immediately. Training fatality? Carson, braking toward attack during simulated engagement. Misjudged the turn angle. Exceeded aircraft limits, entered unrecoverable spin. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring him back. Martin stood, paced to the window overlooking the dispersal area where Carson's squadron mates were preparing for afternoon patrol. We taught him to do something counterintuitive, something that violates every survival instinct, and it killed him. We taught him tactics that have reduced your squadron's loss rate from 17% to 9% in 3 weeks, -1 from today. Ashworth pulled out the statistical analysis she'd been compiling, pages of data that attempted to quantify the unquantifiable. Since introducing unconventional defensive breaks 6 weeks ago, Fighter Command's overall loss rate has dropped from 16.3% to 12.1%. Extrapolated across all operations, that's approximately 68 aircraft not lost, 89 pilots alive. Minus Carson? Yes, minus Carson. She met his eyes. Jeffrey, there is no safe option in combat. Standard doctrine costs lives. Unconventional tactics cost lives. The only question is which approach costs fewer lives over time. And if Carson isn't isolated? If this tactic has a higher training casualty rate than we calculated? Then we refine the training, add safety protocols, better oversight of practice engagements, graduated introduction of unconventional maneuvers. Martin looked at the incident report, at Carson's name, at the words, training accident, unconventional maneuver. I need to write to his parents, he said quietly. I need to explain why their son died learning tactics that a rookie pilot stumbled upon by making a navigational error. You need to explain that their son died learning tactics that have saved 89 other sons. Both truths matter. Both need to be honored. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the mathematics of command that reduced human lives to statistical probabilities and acceptable loss rates. Expand the training program, Martin finally said, but add mandatory safety protocols. And Jeffrey, yes, keep count. Every pilot saved by these tactics. Every pilot lost learning them. Because at the end of this war, we'll need to account for whether innovation saved more than it cost. January 1941. RAF Northolt, Fighter Command Training Conference. The briefing room held squadron commanders from 15 fighter stations across southern England, collectively responsible for 42 squadrons and approximately 480 operational aircraft. Air Vice Marshal Park, commanding officer of 11 Group, stood before them with the exhausted determination of a man who had commanded fighters through the Battle of Britain and understood that survival meant constant evolution. Unconventional defensive breaks, what some pilots are calling wrong-turn tactics, are now standard doctrine for fighter command. Effective immediately, all operational training will include instruction, in both standard and unconventional defensive maneuvers. He gestured to Wing Commander Ashworth, who presented the accumulated data: gun camera footage, loss rate comparisons, tactical analysis, German adaptation patterns. The underlying principle is unpredictability, Ashworth explained. Standard defensive breaks remain the default response. They work, they're safe, they preserve formation cohesion. But pilots are now authorized and encouraged to employ unconventional breaks when tactical situation favors unpredictability over coordination. A hand went up. Squadron Leader Davies from 242 Squadron. Ma'am, how does a pilot in combat, under stress with seconds to decide, determine which tactical situation favors which response? Judgment, experience, training. We can provide guidelines, but ultimately the pilot must assess: am I isolated or do I have mutual support? Is the enemy committed to a specific attack angle? Can I afford the risk of an unconventional response? So more cognitive load during combat. Yes, more decisions, more complexity, but also more flexibility and lower predictability. The resistance was visible in some faces, acceptance in others. Change always met both. Flight Lieutenant Brennan, the rookie whose mistake had started everything, now promoted and assigned to training duties, stood to present the practical training curriculum. We're not teaching pilots to always break toward attack, he said. We're teaching them to recognize moments when unexpected responses provide tactical advantage. The training progression starts with understanding why unconventional breaks work, moves to controlled simulation, then to operational implementation with experienced oversight. He showed footage from operational engagements, pilots successfully employing wrong-turn tactics, fighters disengaging from attacks they'd expected to be certain kills, loss rates declining measurably across squadrons using flexible defensive doctrine. The German pilots are adapting, Brennan continued. They're learning to wait longer before committing to attack angles, maintaining energy advantage to recover from overshoots, approaching from vectors that limit our defensive options. Our advantage is temporary, but temporary advantages matter when they save lives. Air Vice Marshal Park nodded. Questions? The discussion continued for 3 hours, but the decision was already made. Fighter Command would institutionalize what a rookie had discovered accidentally, that sometimes survival required doing exactly what you weren't supposed to do. March 1941, RAF Duxford, Anglo-American Fighter Exchange Program. The American pilots arrived with confidence born from peacetime training and theoretical understanding of aerial combat. Volunteers from the Eagle squadrons, Americans flying for the RAF before their country entered the war, who brought fresh perspectives and different tactical traditions. Captain James Whitmore, former U.S. Army Air Corps instructor, listened to Squadron Leader Webb's presentation on unconventional defensive tactics with polite skepticism. We're taught that defensive turns should maximize angular distance from the attacker. Breaking toward attack reduces that distance. Correct, which is why it works, because it contradicts what the attacker expects. Captain, may I? Flight Lieutenant Brennan stepped forward. I was taught the same doctrine you were. Breaking away, maintaining energy, maximizing angular distance. That doctrine is correct for most situations. But when the enemy has learned your defensive patterns, correctness becomes predictability, and predictability becomes vulnerability. Whitmore studied the operational data, comparative loss rates, gun camera footage, German tactical adaptations. This worked during the Battle of Britain because you were fighting the same enemy repeatedly. They learned your patterns, you changed patterns, temporary advantage. But what about operational environments where enemies don't have time to study your tactics? Then standard doctrine remains optimal, Ashworth confirmed. We're not replacing proven tactics. We're adding flexibility for situations where predictability has become liability. The demonstration flight launched an hour later. Spitfires and Hurricanes in mock combat, demonstrating both standard and unconventional defensive breaks, showing American pilots the geometric relationships that made wrong turns sometimes right. Captain Whitmore flew the final engagement himself, attacking a Spitfire flown by Brennan. 3 times Brennan executed standard breaks and 3 times Whitmore maintained firing position easily. On the 4th engagement, Brennan broke toward attack. Whitmore overshot, briefly lost firing solution, found himself defending rather than attacking. After landing, Whitmore found Webb in the debriefing room. I need to understand the training methodology, because the USAAC is developing fighter doctrine right now, and if we build it on assumptions that ignore what you've learned, we'll repeat your mistakes. The methodology is simple, Webb said. Teach standard doctrine thoroughly, then teach exceptions to doctrine, then teach pilots to recognize which situations call for which response. That's not simple. That's asking pilots to make complex tactical decisions under stress. Yes, which is what combat demands, regardless of how simple we'd like it to be. Over the following weeks, American pilots integrated with RAF squadrons, learning tactics purchased with British blood, sharing perspectives that would shape USAAC fighter doctrine for the entire war. The knowledge flowed both ways. RAF pilots learned American emphasis on energy management. Americans learned British tactical flexibility. National boundaries dissolved in the mathematics of survival. A rookie's wrong turn became doctrine that crossed oceans, languages, and military traditions because geometry didn't respect flags. August 1941. RAF Bentley Priory. Strategic Assessment Review. The conference room held senior commanders from Fighter Command, Bomber Command, Coastal Command, and the Air Ministry, assembled to evaluate 9 months of unconventional defensive tactics and plan for continuing tactical evolution. Air Chief Marshal Dowding, recently stepped down from Fighter Command but still influential in tactical development, reviewed the compiled data with the analytical precision that had defined his leadership during the Battle of Britain. Unconventional defensive breaks have contributed to a reduction in fighter loss rates from 16% during the Battle of Britain to 9% in current operations. This represents approximately 180 aircraft not lost, 180 pilots alive who statistically should be casualties. He paused, letting the numbers settle. However, we observe clear patterns of enemy adaptation. German fighter tactics have evolved to counter unpredictable defensive maneuvers. Longer approach ranges, delayed commitment to attack angles, multi-fighter coordination designed to cover multiple defensive options simultaneously. Wing Commander Ashworth presented the adaptation timeline. The initial tactical surprise lasted approximately 4 months. For the next 3 months, we maintained partial advantage as German pilots adapted inconsistently. Now, 9 months after introduction, we estimate the advantage has degraded to approximately 30% of original effectiveness. Which means, a junior officer asked, which means unconventional breaks still provide benefit, but reduced benefit. The tactic hasn't become obsolete, but it's no longer decisive. Squadron Leader Webb spoke up. Sir, I propose this is actually validation of the underlying principle. Tactical advantage is always temporary. The goal isn't finding permanent solutions. The goal is developing institutional capacity to innovate faster than enemies adapt. Elaborate. A rookie pilot made a navigational error that revealed a gap in our tactical doctrine. We recognized the pattern, tested it systematically, implemented it widely, and achieved measurable reduction in casualties. 9 months later, the enemy has adapted. The specific tactic is degrading, but the process of innovation remains valuable. So we need the next innovation. We need the capacity to continuously generate next innovations. That means institutional culture that encourages questioning doctrine, recognizes patterns in accidents, tests unconventional ideas, and implements changes rapidly. Air Chief Marshal Dowding nodded slowly. You're describing a learning organization, one that treats tactical doctrine as hypothesis rather than certainty, that learns from mistakes, that values adaptation over tradition. Yes, sir, because the enemy is also learning. The side that learns faster survives. The side that becomes certain loses. The room absorbed this truth, that the real innovation wasn't wrong turn tactics, but the willingness to consider that doctrine itself might be wrong. December 10, 1941. Channel Patrol, Combat Engagement. Flight Lieutenant Brennan led a flight of 4 Spitfires on routine patrol over the English Channel, when the radar controller's voice crackled through his headset. Hostile aircraft, Angels 15, Vector 270, estimate 6+. The Bf-109s appeared as dark specks against winter clouds, approaching in the finger 4 formation the Luftwaffe had adopted. 4 aircraft in loose deuce pairs, mutually supporting, tactically flexible. Tally-ho, Brennan announced, then led his flight into climbing intercept using altitude advantage to position for attack. The engagement developed with the brutal speed of experienced pilots meeting experienced pilots. Both sides knew the tactics. Both sides had seen these maneuvers hundreds of times. Both sides were trying to outthink opponents who refused to be predictable. A 109 dove on Brennan from above and behind. Classic bounce textbook approach vector. The attack that started everything 18 months ago. Breaking, Brennan announced, then deliberately, calculatedly, broke toward the attack instead of away. The 109 pilot, veteran enough to recognize unconventional response, adjusted, maintained pursuit, refused to overshoot. This was the adaptation. German pilots who had learned that British fighters sometimes broke the wrong way, who now waited to confirm defensive direction before fully committing. But Brennan had learned too. He snap-rolled inverted mid-turn, converting his toward break into a diving spiral that forced the 109 to choose. Follow into a vertical engagement that favored the Spitfire's better turning characteristics, or break off and reset. The German chose to break off, not from defeat, but from calculation. The attack that had started as high-probability kill had become uncertain engagement with unclear outcome. Better to reset, find easier target, preserve aircraft and pilot for another opportunity. Across the engagement space, similar calculations repeated. British pilots using flexible defensive tactics, German pilots adapting to unpredictability, both sides constantly adjusting based on what the other did. The combat lasted 7 minutes. No aircraft lost on either side. Both formations withdrew with minor damage, mutual respect, and accumulated learning that would inform the next engagement. In the debriefing room afterward, Brennan filled out his combat report with the practiced efficiency of someone who had evolved from rookie to veteran, from accident-prone to intentional. Outcome? The intelligence officer asked. Inconclusive engagement. Enemy broke off when unable to achieve favorable firing position using standard tactics. Do you consider that success? Brennan thought about the question, about the 109 pilot who had adapted to his adaptation, about the endless tactical chess game that defined fighter combat. Sir, I consider it survival, and in 1941, survival is success. March 1942, RAF Staff College, Tactical Doctrine Review. The lecture hall held officers from across the RAF, fighter pilots, bomber crews, intelligence analysts, training instructors, all assembled to review 18 months of tactical evolution that had started with a rookie's navigational error. Air Marshal Sholto Douglas, new commander of Fighter Command, stood before them and delivered an assessment that attempted to quantify the unquantifiable. Unconventional defensive tactics, wrong turn maneuvers, have been integrated into RAF fighter doctrine for 18 months. During that period, fighter loss rates decreased from 16% to an average of 8.7%. Allowing for variables including improved radar, better aircraft, more experienced pilots, and changes in German tactics, we estimate unconventional defensive maneuvers contributed to approximately 30% of that improvement. He paused. That represents approximately 270 aircraft not lost, 270 pilots alive. The statistics were impressive but incomplete. They didn't capture the psychological impact. Pilots feeling less helpless, more empowered to affect outcomes through skill rather than just endure attacks passively. They didn't measure the strategic effect, German resources devoted to adapting tactics rather than developing new capabilities. Wing Commander Ashworth presented the broader analysis. The specific tactic, breaking toward attack, has degraded in effectiveness as German pilots adapted. However, the principle, unpredictability as defensive advantage, remains valid. We've since developed variations, vertical breaks, barrel rolls, scissors maneuvers, all based on the insight that doing what the enemy doesn't expect provides tactical benefit. Flight Lieutenant Brennan, now a squadron leader and senior training officer, addressed the audience. When I broke the wrong way during my 3rd week of operational flying, I wasn't innovating. I was panicking. The innovation was institutional. Squadron Leader Webb recognized pattern instead of dismissing mistake. Wing Commander Ashworth tested hypothesis instead of assuming doctrine was correct. Squadron Leader Martin implemented changes despite personal reservations. The system learned. He paused, looking at faces ranging from veteran aces to newly qualified pilots. The real lesson isn't that breaking toward attack sometimes works. The lesson is that doctrine should be treated as best current understanding, not permanent truth. That accidents sometimes reveal insights. That rookies sometimes see things veterans miss precisely because they don't know what's impossible. That the organization flexible enough to learn from unexpected sources survives, and the organization rigid in its certainty fails. We're fighting an enemy that's also learning. Brennan continued. They adapted to our adaptation. We're adapting to their adaptation to our adaptation. This cycle continues until someone stops innovating, and whoever stops innovating loses. The wrong turn wasn't wrong because it contradicted doctrine. It was right because it worked. And the moment we become certain about what's right, we've created the conditions for being wrong. The room absorbed this in silence, understanding that tactical doctrine had permanently shifted from certainty to flexibility. June 1942. Imperial War Museum, Military Aviation Archives. The museum curator had requested artifacts documenting the development of unconventional fighter tactics. Training manuals, combat reports, gun camera footage, the physical evidence of how doctrine evolved from accident to institution. Squadron Leader Brennan provided everything except what the curator wanted most: a clean narrative of innovation. The official history will emphasize tactical genius, the curator explained. The brilliant insight that changed fighter combat. That's what inspires future generations. The truth, Brennan countered, is that I made a navigational error during my third week of combat. I broke the wrong way because I was disoriented and inexperienced. The fact that my mistake happened to exploit a gap in enemy tactics was accident, not genius. But you systematized the accident, turned mistake into doctrine. No, Squadron Leader Webb systematized it. Wing Commander Ashworth validated it through testing. Squadron Leader Martin implemented it despite reservations. Dozens of test pilots refined it. Hundreds of combat pilots proved it operationally. I just got lucky and survived long enough for smarter people to recognize what I'd done accidentally. The curator studied the combat report from Brennan's first engagement, the one where everything went wrong in exactly the right way. Military history requires heroes, clear narratives, decisive moments where individuals change outcomes. Military history requires honesty about how innovation actually happens. It's not brilliant individuals having eureka moments. It's accidents being noticed, patterns being recognized, institutions being flexible enough to question their own certainty. He pulled out statistical analysis, showing the evolution of tactical effectiveness over 18 months. Initial dramatic advantage, gradual enemy adaptation, continuing but reduced benefit, development of new variations. This data shows what actually happened. Temporary advantage gained through unpredictability, followed by enemy adaptation, followed by our counter-adaptation, in endless cycle. If the official history simplifies this into rookie discovers brilliant tactic, we lose the real lesson, which is that survival in warfare, maybe in anything, requires institutional humility, the willingness to learn from accidents, question doctrine, implement changes even when they contradict experience, and keep innovating even when innovations become obsolete. That's a complex message. Sir, warfare is complex. Training is complex. Tactical evolution is complex. Simplifying it into heroic narrative might inspire people, but it won't teach them the most important lesson, that certainty kills, flexibility survives, and the wrong turn is sometimes exactly right. The curator looked at him for a long moment. That won't fit neatly into museum display. Then maybe, Brennan said quietly, the museum needs to get comfortable with messiness. November 1945, Oxford University, School of Military History. Thomas Brennan, civilian now with a distinguished flying cross and a permanent place in RAF tactical history, stood before students who had been children when the war began and delivered a lecture that attempted to extract meaning from chaos. How many of you believe military innovation comes from brilliant strategists making calculated decisions? Most hands went up. You're mostly wrong. Some innovation comes from deliberate analysis, yes. But significant innovation often comes from accidents, mistakes, and inexperienced people doing things they don't know they're not supposed to do. He showed them the gun camera footage from his third operational mission, the wrong turn that shouldn't have worked, the geometry that violated doctrine, the survival that made no sense according to everything RAF training taught. This is a navigational error by a rookie pilot who got disoriented during combat. It saved my life not because it was smart, but because it was unexpected. The innovation wasn't the turn itself. The innovation was the institutional response. Experienced officers willing to question whether my mistake revealed something they'd missed. The lecture hall was quiet. Wrong turn tactics saved approximately 270 lives during 18 months of operational use. That number matters, but what matters more is understanding why it worked. Not because the specific tactic was perfect, but because it was unpredictable. The moment it became standard, the enemy adapted. The advantage was always temporary. He paused, looking at faces too young to remember bombing but old enough to understand implications. In your careers, military, civilian, technical, academic, you will develop expertise and establish procedures based on that expertise. Those procedures will be correct based on current understanding, but circumstances change. Enemies adapt. What worked yesterday might fail tomorrow. The question isn't whether you follow doctrine. The question is whether you maintain the intellectual flexibility to recognize when doctrine needs updating. I broke the wrong way during combat not because I was brilliant, but because I was confused. What transformed confusion into doctrine was an organization humble enough to learn from rookies, flexible enough to test unconventional ideas, and courageous enough to change procedures that weren't working. The wrong turn taught us that sometimes being wrong is exactly right, but only if you're in an organization capable of recognizing the difference.